Welcome to Sounding Board, a production of Seroptimist International of Novato, whose mission it is to improve the lives of women and girls through programs leading to social and economic empowerment. I'm Freda Kaplan, and my guests today are Pamela Taylor and Nancy Hult Ganis, who were Pan Am stewardesses. We're going to be talking about flying, women in flight, and women around the world. So, would you like to tell us a little about the history?
Well, one of the unique things about Pan Am as a global airline, and the only global airline, is they were flying into places that were truly uncharted, dangerous, without any modern facilities. So they didn't hire women until 1944, unlike the domestic carriers. And some of the first women they hired were pilots that flew for the WASP during the military, during World War II. But when the war was over, they were not allowed to fly commercially or even for the military. And so Pan Am offered them jobs to apply for stewardesses, and those who were qualified did. And it showed the incredible adventure and danger of air travel in those days. And the countries we flew from, Africa, South America, Asia, they were in turmoil, and they were developing countries and often unpredictable. And so the adventures that we were exposed to as a result of that were just unimaginable, both fun and frightening. As Pam certainly can testify, having been part of a few of those adventures.
Tell us about some of those.
Well, let's see. I'll tell you about a couple of the adventures that were very much part of my history. When I first started flying, I had been flying for 2 years, and I was sent to Hong Kong, the Hong Kong base. And that was a very senior base, but I just happened to be in the office at the time when they needed someone immediately, so I was able to transfer. But we flew only in and out of Vietnam. We went to Pleiku, Da Nang, Cam Bay, and Saigon, and we picked up troops and flew them to the R&R areas. We flew DC-6s because that was the airplane Pan Am didn't need any longer, and the government rented them from us for $1 a month. Maybe it was $1 a year. And so the Pan Am crews would pick up the troops, and those old airplanes in Vietnam would take so long to cool down, and you'd go into Vietnam and everybody was sweating. We'd pick up 88 different troops. They were all men. We didn't have women going in and out of Vietnam then. But then we took them to the R&R areas, Penang, Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, Bangkok, Taipei, and Manila, I believe. So that was a wonderful base for a couple of years, and then they disbanded that after a while. And then some of the other adventures that I had that were a little more frightening were flying into Tehran after the Shah had left. He had chartered 2 Pan Am airplanes and filled them with gold, and then Pan Am flew them out. We were told that we could send in a letter if we were afraid to go into Iran, because we were getting frightened after a while. They had imposed martial law at 8 o'clock, and our flight arrived just before 8, and if we came in late at all, then we wouldn't be able to make it to the hotel. If you were caught on the road, they would shoot at the cars. So a couple of times I spent the night on the airplane because we were really just too frightened to go to the hotel. The hotel was an hour away from the airport. So then they eventually stopped. They took the prisoners at the embassy. All the embassy people were captured, and then they halted everything. And then going in and out of Jakarta, we had to be careful. because Sukarno was murdering all of his generals. And we couldn't lay over there. We flew in, but we were told to stand away from the doors because people had been shot. We picked up maybe one person and would drop off maybe one person in Jakarta. And then we would fly on to Singapore where we would lay over. But that was the year of Living Dangerously. They made the movie about that period where Sukarno was shooting everyone. But then I guess the most memorable but frightening time of my career was going into Vietnam and taking the last flight out. And that was once the airport closed. They didn't want to take anyone out too soon because they wanted the operation to continue. And we were called in the morning. I was first called at home and asked if I would fly into Vietnam. They were setting up a crew for the very last flight, and they asked if I would go. I didn't say yes right away, but then I did decide to go and called them, and the next day they positioned me in Guam. And I was in Guam for 10 days. Before a crew was put together, we had just a few people. We didn't need to have 6 doors manned because none of the FAA rules mattered. When you took a Mercy flight in, everything was restricted. We went in without manning the doors. The tower wasn't even operating. So we were called, we got a crew together in Manila, and President Ford had sent a message to the operations in Manila, and they told us we could go in if we wanted to. We didn't have to, but 6 of us volunteered. One was a Vietnamese stewardess who was trying to get her parents out and her 4 sisters. We were called on a Thursday, but the Tuesday before we had operated a regular commercial flight in. And operating that flight in, we had 17 people on a 747, which was a tragedy because so many people were trying to get out. When we were flying in, I went through the cabin and spoke to each person, trying to figure out why they'd want to go into Vietnam when everyone was trying to get out. I met a couple of military fellows who were going back to look for their girlfriends. Then I met a Vietnamese colonel in full uniform, a South Vietnamese colonel, and he just wanted to get his son out. He had a family of 5, and he said he didn't think he'd be able to get out, but he wanted his son to make it. I told him that I would take his son. His son was 5 years old. When I told Cha, the Vietnamese stewardess, she went over and made a deal with him that if he got her sisters onto Tan Son Nhut, the air base, that we would take his son. So he promised he would get the sisters onto the air base, and we said to hide them in cargo and also to put his son there. So in the meantime, the 10 days before, we had collected uniforms and wigs. And when we arrived that Thursday on the last flight, we went into the cargo area and didn't see Cha's sisters anywhere, and we found them in a closet. So we took in the wigs and the uniforms and dressed them up and told them to walk out to the airplane and pretend they knew what they were doing. The sisters were very good. The uniforms all fit. Everyone was about the same size in those days. But they got on the airplane, and then the colonel had left word with the sisters that he got his entire family out the day before on a boat. So he had his son. And the captain had said to do whatever we wanted to do because he was going to turn the red light, the flashing light on at the top of the airplane, and that would alert everyone to get back as fast as we could. But he said he wouldn't leave anyone behind. And people still needed visas to get on the airplane. And people the Tuesday before were begging us to take their children, but we couldn't take the children because they didn't have the visas, and the guards were everywhere with the machine guns. When we started loading people on the airplane, we started collecting local currency. We went through and asked everyone to empty their pockets. They weren't going to need the money. They were leaving the country. And we started collecting more and more funds. And we took the pillowcases to the bottom of the ramp, and then the guards started allowing more and more people on.
Without visas?
Without visas, yes. We were paying them off. Everyone was paid off in Vietnam. So we were able to get a lot on. But that Tuesday we left with an empty airplane. We only got a couple of children on because we hid some of the children that were up to our waists. We would gather around them, and then we could walk by immigrations and they wouldn't see them because we had the stewardesses crowding around. And then when we closed the door that day, the gate agent pulled her baby out of her jacket and handed it to us. We put the babies and the children in the restrooms and in a couple of secret spots we had on the airplane. And when the guards went through to check all the visas that day, they would bang on the restroom door, and we would pull a lipstick out quickly and open the door very fast and slam it. We'd make sure they saw the lipstick so they would think we were getting ready for the flight. But the very last flight, everyone came out, and they weren't allowed to carry baggage, just a little handbag. I had a couple of men from, excuse me, the embassy who had sacks of US dollars, wanted to take them. We took one, but we weren't allowed to take all of them. We needed the weight for the people. And at the very end of the flight, the fellow who let us out with the lights jumped up the wheel well and climbed on the airplane through the cockpit. So, and then just as we were ready to take off, a little fighter crashed on the airport, and the captain was afraid they were going to try to take the aircraft. We were able to get a bulldozer to get on, to bulldoze the plane off right away. The captain's brother was a POW at that time. He was still in captivity when we left, and he wasn't released for another year or two. But we made it out. We had to spiral up. And when we left, it was a very sad time because people were leaving their families, their relatives. Nobody had time to say goodbye. And one of Cha's sisters had her 5-year-old son on her lap. Her husband was out in the field fighting for the South Vietnamese army, and he didn't know she was leaving. And he wasn't able to escape to the States until 10 years later. So, and we never got her parents out. They came out eventually, many years later, but we weren't able. Cha was afraid she'd lose her passport. She was Vietnamese, but she was a US citizen. And when we left, everybody squeezed our hands in the aisles. People were crying. It wasn't a time to celebrate. But on the other hand, they were happy they were leaving. And when we got back, we were supposed to land in Manila. We had very little fuel, and the Filipino government refused to allow us to land. So the captain went on to Clark, but we didn't have much fuel, and when we finally landed in Clark, Manila didn't want all the refugees, just like now. They're making noises about taking Syrian refugees. So it's sad to see in our country that they're not going to take them, or aren't welcoming them with open arms the way the Canadians are. But we took them to Clark, and then the Americans took them in. The Americans took over 1 million refugees from Vietnam. And they went to Clark, where they were in camps for 4 months or so before they were sent on to the States. And the Vietnamese have been some of the most productive people that we have ever taken in. They have done so well, started all kinds of businesses. Their children have graduated at the head of the classes at universities across the U.S.
That was the end of the Vietnam War.
Yes, yes. And I met some of those refugees 20 years later because we had a reunion. But only recently I met the little 5-year-old boy who had a family of 2 children and a lovely wife. And I had gone to the Vietnamese stewardess, had a daughter after that, and her daughter was married. And then the sisters all came to the wedding, of course. And then
Whoa,
I saw
small
Mom.
world.
Yes, yes.
Oh my.
So,
That's
and then I have
amazing.
one other, do we have time?
Oh,
One
yes.
other experience that I'd like to mention, and that was the Hajj. Now, Nancy flew the Hajj too, didn't you?
Mm-hmm.
She was stationed in Iran, flying pilgrims to Jeddah, and I was stationed in Indonesia. And in Indonesia, we gathered people from all the archipelago. Many of them didn't even speak the language of the main islands in Indonesia, the Indonesian language. They spoke dialects of all sorts. But we had 2 Indonesians on our flights, and they flew for a little local airline that flew around pigs and goats and things like that. And they had to give the announcements in their native tongue, but they told me that none of the pilgrims understood them. But the pilgrims from Indonesia were all dressed in white. They were the most peaceful, beautiful people that I've ever had on the airplane. We had to make sure that they didn't start fires in the aisles because they were so used to starting a little fire and doing their cooking. They had all their pots and pans with them on the airplane. And we had to honor their way. We could only use one hand when we served them. And in the middle of the flight, they would break out in this soft singing, and they were praying. And they would do that usually twice during the flight. We had to make sure they didn't use the closets as restrooms because they weren't familiar with restrooms. And when they would go in the restrooms, they would open the doors and leave them wide open. And then they'd stand on the toilets. But then when they would leave the airplane, they were so sweet, and they'd all go, namaste, namaste. It was just beautiful. They were beautiful people. And going into Jeddah, they had airplanes from every corner of the world, airlines I'd never even heard of. And as soon as they would get off the airplane, they would go right under the wing and start unpacking all the pots and pans and all their gear, because in those days they didn't have hotels for them to stay in. They stayed in tents, and they had areas where all the tents would go off to the right. They'd gather them up under the wings and move them on to where the tents were. And we were told not to go into that area because the airplanes were landing one right after the other. And once when I was on the ground for 20 minutes, 40 minutes, I went behind the scenes. They had sheets that were partitioning everybody off, and I went behind and wandered in, and the Africans were all dressed in bright colors with baskets on their heads. The Iranians would travel in black. So everybody, many of them traveled in white, of other nationalities, the Tunisians and some of the other Africans, but they were just the most fascinating people. And we returned with a couple of extra passengers because women had babies, and several of the passengers died because after we would take them, then there was a 6-week, wasn't it 6 weeks or 4 weeks period where we would be free just to go anywhere in the world we wanted to go. But we had to return to our base. I had to go back to Indonesia and Nancy to Iran. And then we would start up again, and then we would fly to Jeddah to pick them up, and then we'd bring them all back to their homeland. And we stopped. My flight stopped in Karachi on the way, and we'd get off for a couple days there and play a lot of tennis and travel or whatever we wanted to do, and then we'd pick it up later and take them on to Jeddah. But it was a wonderful experience. It was one of the best experiences.
Jeddah isn't the ultimate goal there.
Well, now they have an airport in Medina, but that was a couple of hours by bus.
And Mecca is where they were
Mecca,
heading.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm sorry. No, I meant Mecca and Medina because those are the two holiest spots
I see.
in Saudi Arabia. But they had a beautiful airport in Jeddah. But now I'm sure they have many big hotels and
It was basically sand and
yeah,
camels. when we
sand and
landed in there.
camels and tents, all
Yeah.
the tents.
It was, and when I think back about that time, it was so extraordinary because we were clearly the oddballs in that world.
Oh, yes.
And yet everyone was very gracious and kind, and it just shows the incredible reach, though, of Pan Am. And I think it was sort of an extension to the State Department. And often we were called to do secret missions that nobody knew about. The United States was not supposed to know about the Six-Day War in Israel, but the night before it was Pan Am called out of Rome. A crew was called in the middle of the night and said, "You don't have to do this, but we're going in to rescue people." And this was before the war started. So they clearly knew, and this happened all over the place.
All over. Pan Am did the Berlin airlift. They did many of the airlifts through the Middle East with all of the uprising.
South
Now,
America.
yeah, South America, everywhere. They were always called. That's why it was sad to see the way it ended, because of
It ended because of horrible politics and
Yes.
short-sightedness on the behalf of on our.
and mismanagement.
Yeah, I mean, once one trip was gone, it became, in some ways, almost what happened to Apple when Steve Jobs left initially, and then they called him back. That is kind of what happened with Pan Am, where the board didn't really understand what Pan Am was and what it was to the country, to the world. And because of petty politics and mismanagement, a great American institution went down.
A giant. They were the greatest airline in the history of the world.
And Lockerbie was sort of the death knell. That was, I don't think they could recover after that. And yet, it's the tragedy. Here was this great country, a great company that did so much for its employees and people around the world. And the short-sightedness of our Congress that did not realize that this was an American icon to be protected allowed it to be destroyed by petty politics. And starting with Richard Nixon.
Really?
Yeah.
How did that happen?
He wanted, Richard Nixon in one trip did not necessarily see eye to eye.
One Trip was the head of Pan Am.
Yes.
The founder.
The founder of Pan Am was One Trip. And he and Richard Nixon had a different global vision. And One Trip saw the possibility in human nature and different cultures. Richard Nixon was about control. And he wanted One Trip to give up Pan Am's caterer, which was Maxime's of Paris, which was this international French cuisine that One Trip felt was Pan Am's cachet. And Richard Nixon, because of favors, wanted One Trip to accept Marriott as the caterer, and One Trip refused. Richard Nixon then made a deal with American Airlines, where American Airlines would make Marriott their caterer. And suddenly, American Airlines is flying into the Caribbean into Pan Am routes, but Pan Am is not allowed to fly domestically. And that was really the beginning of unfair competition and the beginning of deregulation, but it hurt a great American carrier that represented so much to the world and set up the sort of destroying the underpinnings of a great company. And it's ironic that during the economic crisis, the auto industry was saved, but this great airline that did so much was not. And in The Aviator, it was a misrepresentation when one trip was trying to prevent TWA from competing on their routes internationally, not because they wanted to have a monopoly, because they didn't, but one trip was trying to show that that kind of competition was going to destroy them both, because they were already competing with all the international carriers that were given special compensation by the State Department for political favors. And that kind of complexity is hard for the average person to understand. And so Pan Am was this great company, but it was also, as a representative of the U.S., a great target. And sadly, one of the greatest American companies ever went down.
One that had contributed so much to history.
To the world's history.
To the world, you're right, by introducing air travel around the world.
And that history is really not known, and it's so fascinating.
Well, we only have a little time left, but I'd like to thank you for talking about this and just mention briefly that there was a TV show made about Pan Am in 2012, was that?
2013, maybe? Was it 13?
I think we
12,
aired
12.
2012, yeah.
And you were involved in that?
I created it.
Oh.
Nancy was one of the producers.
Yeah, it was, I spent many years developing the concept. And the reason I wanted to do it is because I realized that we had such a distorted sense of the world, and that if I could help audiences see the world through unexpected eyes of these young women who went off to see the world, that we might dispel some of the anger and fear of people, that people had of each other. And when I first went to work in the entertainment industry, I was really shocked at how little people with so much power in the executive branch and the creative branch, how little they knew of the world out there that they were informing, and how we lived in this bubble, and how dangerous it was to project images and ideas and stories without understanding really the cultural differences and the potential to insult and hurt and create false impressions.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
It didn't quite work, but that was my goal.
Show.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both for being with us today. We've learned so much, and whoa, so much. Pamela Taylor, Nancy Hult Ganis, and thanks for joining us on Sounding Board. Thanks to the Seroptimus crew and our engineer Leon Johnson for help with the production of Sounding Board. And you can see our archive shows, about 100 of them, on seropnovato.org online. Special thanks for the use of the studio at the Buck Institute for Research on Aging. Thank you, folks, for watching.
Thank you.